Hey folks, welcome to the video on utilitarianism and Peter Singer. And I'm first going to kind of give you an explanation and go over utilitarianism, which is a moral theory. And then I'm going to go over Singer's original article that you're required to read from the 70s that sort of really got the ball rolling on this argument about charity, which is the focus. And we'll see how Singer applies utilitarian reasoning to this problem of charity. And I know that I'm not going to go over, there's a couple other articles by Singer in the TED Talk. I'm not going to go over everything there, although I might make reference to them. But I'm just going to go over to give you a foundation in Singer's original ideas. And anyways, let's do that. So utilitarianism is one type of moral theory, and I know I've mentioned moral theories before. We talked about ethical egoism when we talked about Ayn Rand, which was a type of moral theory. In this class, the main moral theories we focused on are cultural or moral relativism, and we've seen that now with Nietzsche's own version of it, with the pre-Socratics. And ethical egoism was Rand's view, which is the idea that what is really morally right is to follow our own interests. It's not to help others, it's to help ourselves, and then we can help others. Those are the kind of two moral theories we've really focused on thus far. And now we're going to look at utilitarianism, which is a whole other breed, if you will, of theories. So sometimes utilitarianism is classed as a type of what's called consequentialism. And I know it's a lot of isms, but I hope that helps because it's about consequences. So if the question we're asking regarding morality is, what does it mean when we call something morally right? A relativist answers that, well, it doesn't really mean anything. It just means that you're following the cultural norms you're a part of. If you think dog eating is okay if you live in certain parts of Southeast Asia, and you think it's not okay if you live in America, right? That's what a relativist would say the meaning of what is morally right is. However, a utilitarian says, actually, what we mean when we say what's morally right is, does it lead to positive or negative consequences? What are the consequences? And you might say, yeah, but isn't consequences a pretty broad term? Well, utilitarians typically cash out consequences in terms of pain and pleasure. So if an act leads to more overall pleasure, it is good, versus an act that leads to more overall pain, which is bad. Now, we need to distinguish this view from the view that we talked about with the Stoics. So recall that the Stoics, who argue that we have to kind of have this peace and serenity in our mind, they were responding to the hedons, and the hedons were people who believed that pain and pleasure was all that mattered for the individual. So hedonism is a view that says the meaning of life is for individuals to pursue just at pleasure, at their whatever they want to do. So that's why hedonists were sometimes known to be people who partied a lot, had a lot of sex, and drank a lot of beer, and didn't worry about their weight and things like that. That's not utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is saying that what we do should lead to the collective good, not an individual good. And that's the difference. So sometimes it's actually talked about as the greater good. Utilitarians say that acts that are morally right are defined that way, are defined as right, if they are more likely to lead to the greater good for all involved, to the greater good for everyone. And so you can see the connection here to Singer already, who says we should donate to charity because he's seeking the greater good for the entire world, for every human and every being that is living on this planet. He wants the greater good for, not just for himself, not just for his family, but for everyone. So utilitarians are people who want the greater good for the greatest amount of people. And if you're interested in the historical roots of the theory, you can go back to a guy named John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is the one who created the theory in the Western world, although their roots of that sort of thinking go back to ancient China as well. But in terms of like codifying and creating a full-on theory, Bentham comes in and does that in the West, and then John Stuart Mill advances that theory. So anyways, that's utilitarianism. Now let me just mention some criticisms of that theory, some disquieting implications that I'm sure some of you have noticed already. If the main function of morality, if the main meaning behind what it means when we say something's morally right or wrong is the end result, what does that say about the process of getting to that end result? Well, that means that it seems, according to the theory, we could potentially use people in order to get to a greater good. So let me just take kind of a manufactured example to make the point. Let's say we have a society where 98% of the people are super happy and are having a great time and have all the things they need. But in order for that 98% to be happy, 2% of the population have to be completely enslaved. Maybe they're living in a dungeon and they're producing all the labor that's actually leading to the 98% to be happy and to have the things they need. For a utilitarian, at first glance, you'd have to say, well, that's the greater good, right? That's the greater good is served because most people in the society are happy. But this is where we run into the problem with utilitarianism, because in order for that to happen, we had to use those people to get there, right? So what about those people? So utilitarians ignore motivation. They ignore kind of internal qualities that we might say are morally right or wrong. Another problem can be seen in this example. So let's say you have, let's think of a war environment. You have some soldiers standing around in a war-like environment, and they're at their camp. But an enemy combatant comes into this circle of soldiers standing around and throws a grenade in the middle of the soldiers. Let's say you have one of those soldiers who's trained to be extremely selfless, jumps on the grenade, he's going to sacrifice himself to save everyone else. Now, but let's say the grenade ended up being a dud. It doesn't actually go off and it doesn't kill the soldier. According to utilitarianism, because there was no consequences, right, nothing happened, that nothing really right or wrong was done there, right? The lack of consequences, if there's no consequences to point to, you can't really locate what's morally right or wrong as utilitarian. And yet, in that situation, if you're like me, you want to say that that soldier who jumped on the grenade is good. I want to say, God, what an amazing thing for him to do that. But in order to do that, I would have to look at his motivation. Right, so the point I'm making here is that utilitarianism ignores motivation in that way. It says that what matters is the end result, not the reason you got there. So another example would be, you could have a really bad motivation, like you could want to kill somebody, and then if you try to kill them and you miss, you didn't really do anything wrong because there were no bad consequences. The wrongness would have only started to occur, according to utilitarians, once the person was harmed, once the consequence of harm came about. But even if you had a bad motivation and you wanted him to die, that wouldn't really reach the level of wrongness yet for a utilitarian, because that focuses on the motivation. So anyways, these are some of the problems with utilitarianism. And if you're interested in this idea of moral theorizing about different moral frameworks, like I've said in other videos, definitely take an ethics class. I want to mention one more thing about utilitarianism. So ever since John Stuart Mill and Bentham, the guys who kind of got the ball rolling on the theory, people like Peter Singer have been working with and modifying the theory. And there's actually two different camps that have arisen in utilitarianism. So there are people called act utilitarians, and there are people called rule-based utilitarians. So some utilitarians see the consequences of an action being right or wrong based on the actual action itself, based on the act that is produced. So, it's if a bomb blows up and kills and hurts people, that's bad because of those consequences of that act. But rule utilitarians came about to try to deal with some of the problems, the motivation problem. And they basically say, okay, well, it's not acts that are right or wrong based on consequences. It's that if we have particular rules that we follow, they will lead to better consequences or worse consequences. So the rule utilitarians say that it's not about the actions that make it morally right or wrong, it's the consequences of the rules we follow. So for instance, if I had a rule to follow that said, don't lie most of the time, then, except in extreme cases maybe when I might hurt someone if I didn't lie, then that would be a good rule to follow for a rule utilitarian. They'd say, okay, look, if you follow that rule that of not lying, it will overall lead to better consequences. So in other words, so let's go back to the grenade example. What if I said I have a rule that people should act selflessly when they can if they have the courage to do so? If I had some rule like that, then I could say what that soldier did was good because ultimately he did something that would have prevented harm based on that rule. So anyways, I know that gets a little complex into utilitarianism, but I just wanted to mention some of the consequences and the different ways utilitarians have of dealing with the objections and contradictions. It's a very significant, important theory in the academic world. And it's not just people like who we're studying today, Peter Singer, who use it. And it's not just people in philosophy. It's been a highly influential theory that's actually had an impact on even government policy, thinking about the overall consequences of pain and pleasure, for particular acts and bills and so forth. And what's interesting about the theory is that it was actually created by Jeremy Bentham as for political reasons, because he was sick of people disagreeing politically, and he said, can't we just have some theory that allows us to determine which action will lead to more or less, positive or negative results? He wanted to eliminate the arguments people were having about morality. He wanted to just put it into a hard and fast formula. Whether he was successful and whether the theory is successful, I'll let you be the judge. But anyways, that is the foundation that you should have for reading Singer. And Singer's article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, a very influential article. As I mentioned, he's updated this argument in the New York Times article that I provide in the module, as well as in the more recent TED Talk. And he has had a hand in this movement. I wouldn't say he necessarily started it, but he certainly helped to start it, influenced it. This movement now called effective altruism. So one of Singer's main points is that we want to help people, but the desire to help isn't enough. Going back to Nietzsche, you can't just virtue signal and say, post something that talks about how terrible it is and that people are starving. You have to actually go and do something or donate, find some way to actually help. So Singer is after us putting our minds and heart in the same place, as I believe a point he makes in the TED Talk. And a lot of his argument revolves around this premise that we have more stuff than we need, especially people like you and me. And I know that's probably weird for some of you guys to think, because you're like, I'm a poor college student. But even the fact that you have the ability to go to a college like this one, you're lucky, right? We're all lucky. The fact that you speak English, you're lucky. The fact that you've been able to learn to speak English, to learn to speak a dominant language in the world, you're lucky. Just like people who learned to speak Greek when that was the lingua franca in the ancient world, they were lucky. And so we have to admit that even though I totally get it, and I've been a macaroni cheese eating or ramen eating college student myself, we have to admit that just by virtue of us being born into this, where we've been born into, this part of the world, and having the ability to go to a university and to advance yourself, we're lucky. There's lots of people, perhaps the majority of people in the world, who never even get up to that level. In some cases, as we all know, unfortunately, it's much worse. There's people who are born into cities that are, or towns that are controlled by military crackpots, in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa where there's very little government and very little control, and it's just basically, going back to the will to power in Nietzsche, it's just basically some cruel overlord. Sometimes drug-addled soldiers will come through the towns and rape the women, and the kids will get sold into certain types of economic slavery or military slavery. Anyways, we have to admit that even if we're broke, and I get it, we all are, it's tough, we're not as worse off as many people in this world. And that's what you have to remember, that Singer, this is the place that Singer's coming from in his argument, is to remind us that even lower middle class people in America are significantly better off than most people in the rest of the world. And he wants us to use that additional value, literally economic value that we have to help others, to bring them out of this level of poverty. Now, one other thing I'd add here is that you may remember the distinction between positive and negative liberty when we talked about political philosophy with Rand and Marx. And remember, positive liberty is kind of the right to get stuff, the right to have things guaranteed to you. And Singer is clearly coming from a positive liberty perspective as well. So he's a utilitarian, but he's leaning on the side of positive liberty. Utilitarianism is actually itself somewhat on the side of positive liberty. That there should be a redistribution of wealth, that there should be some level of equality, that people deserve to have a certain level of support, including in healthcare, being provided with basic needs. Notice that libertarians wouldn't necessarily think so. They would think that those needs can be provided in other ways by private industries and so forth. But Singer is more or less arguing for, one way to put it is socialism for the whole world. Right? He's arguing for socialism for the whole world. He's not like Marx. Marx was arguing that the government of a nation needs to be socialist so that the people within the nation can have fairly distributed wealth and goods. And whereas Singer is saying that we need to do that on a grand scale, and it's not just the government, it's that people, individual people and earners, have to help as well redistribute that wealth. But the idea is the same, that Marx wanted to redistribute the wealth within a country or a nation or a state, whereas Singer wants to redistribute the wealth throughout the world. Now, where Singer gets beyond Marx here is in his utilitarian view, because for a utilitarian, all life has value. It does not matter what culture you're from. It does not matter your gender. It does not matter your race. Every human being has value. And in fact, for many utilitarians, Singer included, animals have value because they also can suffer. They can be caused pain and pleasure as well. Which is, again, what leads people like Singer to be vegetarians. So all life has value for Singer. And because of that, he believes that we need to have a more fairly equitable distribution of wealth around the world. And basically, Singer sees this problem. It's kind of like if you walk into a room and there's one kid playing with all the toys, and there's these other lonely kids who don't have any toys to play with. You'd be like, hey, what the hell? Let these kids play with some of those toys. And Singer is saying that's more or less what our world is like. The toys are held by a small percentage of the population. They have most of the wealth, while many of the other people are just struggling to get by. They can't even, let alone find a toy to play with. They can't even get to the point where they can actually play with toys because they're working so many jobs to just make ends meet. Right? Or they're not even able to have enough food to eat to even get to the point of having a job. Right? So for Singer, this is a problem. And in the same way you would want to rectify the situation with the kid, one kid hogging all the stuff, Singer says, let's do that with our world. Some people are hogging all the resources on this planet. There's plenty of resources to go around. Right? Isn't that something funny to think about? This has actually been calculated. Poverty could be solved. It's actually possible. There is enough for everyone, despite how big the population is. And yet it's not been fairly distributed. Right? Not everyone has what they need. This is what Singer wants us to see. So his article, like I said, was written in the 70s, and that might seem dated, but remember, first of all, don't commit the genetic fallacy, which says that just because something came from a particular time, it's not worth reading. Do you think the Bible's not worth reading because it was written 2,000 years ago? Of course it is. Right? Of course the Quran's worth reading. Of course it's worth reading Plato or Socrates. It doesn't matter how long ago it was written. Truth and core ideas and values that are lasting and important will be valuable whenever you read them. But anyways, even regardless of that, it's very clear to see how we can update Singer's argument for using modern examples, and it's very easy to see how his argument still applies fully to our world. In some cases, one could argue it applies even more than it did in the time he wrote it. So he begins by discussing this Bangladesh Liberation War, which was a big issue at the time, a big war at the time, and was producing a bunch of refugees around the world. And, we can update this to one of the many different wars happening in the Middle East that's producing refugees, and many of the other wars around the world producing refugees, and it's the same idea. But Singer's point here is that he mentions the British government, and he says, look, the British government has donated some to help these people who are refugees, and so has the Australian government. They've done something to help. But then he points out that the disparity in the amount that they've given versus what they've spent on other things. So, for instance, in the British government has donated some money, he says, but they spent more on a high-speed train. The Australian government had donated some, but it was 1/12 of the price of what they paid for a new opera house. So this theme will continue throughout Singer's article. Material wealth, we care more about that than we care about people. We'd rather have, as a nation, a new opera house than we would help people. And as individuals, we'd rather have the new cell phone or the new shirt than we would help other people. So that's a major theme. We care more about material stuff than we care about people. Now after this, he goes on to make a couple of assumptions that he thinks are uncontroversial. In particular, the first assumption. And this first assumption is that suffering from starvation and lack, is bad. Suffering from starvation and dying of starvation is bad. And what he's doing here is he's trying to, in a subtle way, argue against relativism. Because, of course, somebody could say, well, Singer, look, man, it's just your opinion of what you consider suffering. It's just your subjective view. One person's suffering is another person's pleasure. One could argue from a relativist, subjectivist perspective. But Singer would say, no way. If you're telling me that it's just my opinion that when a kid dies it's bad, that's ridiculous. He said nobody likes to suffer. It's obvious when someone is suffering, they don't like it. Even animals yelp and scream and writhe when they're in pain. It's bad when people suffer. Clearly the kid wants to eat if he's starving. So basically what Singer is saying is, we're going to have to part ways here. If you don't think that suffering has any meaning or that badness has any meaning, if I can point to a kid who's dying of starvation and you're telling me that that's not bad, Singer says we can't have a further conversation. So he basically says, either we agree on this very basic principle of life that suffering sucks and is bad, or else you can't read the rest of my article. Right? So this is where, if you are a relativist, you'd have to step off the Singer train, because you do have to believe in some objective level of suffering, and that is bad for his argument to follow. So he begins there. Then he goes on and he gives perhaps what's one of his most famous examples in philosophy, called the drowning child example, or the child in a shallow pond example. And he does this to emphasize his second principle, which is basically, if we can stop something bad from happening without sacrificing something of equal moral importance, we should do it. In other words, if we can stop something from happening without making a huge sacrifice to our own moral beliefs or our own life, we should do that thing. So the child in the shallow pond is a perfect example. So you walk by, the example is this, you're walking through a park or something and there's a pond and there's a kid who's kind of flailing around in the pond and he's clearly drowning. Now imagine you were to say, well, I got my nice work pants on, right? This kid's life, yeah, he's going to drown, but then I'm going to have to go wash my pants and I'm going to have to be late to work. And imagine if you said that. People would think you're a monster. They'd say, how dare you not jump in and save the child? He was clearly suffering, and here's the point. His life is way more valuable. It's of more moral importance than your pants getting muddy. Right? So that's Singer's point, is that if we can do something that would help somebody else that's more valuable than what we have to do to get them there, we should do it. We should save the kid. Everybody agrees with that. Right? Nobody would think, for the most part, most people wouldn't say, no, I'm not going to save the kid. Most people would say, yeah, save the kid, dirty your pants. However, Singer uses that to shine a light back on us, because he says, but we're basically doing the same thing every time we spend on new things, right? Every time we buy that new upgraded cell phone, when our previous cell phone works perfectly fine, we just want it to be a little faster. Every time we get some extra money and we buy a new video game, when we already have enough games to play at home, we just want to get the new one. Right? Every time we order a new show or we order a movie we want to watch, when we have plenty of other stuff to watch already. So what could we be doing with that extra money? Singer says we could be donating to charities, we could be putting our effort into, we could be going to soup kitchens, we could be putting our effort and time into helping other people, instead of just racking up material possessions. And notice what that implies. It implies that the idea is that we all think it's terrible when a person doesn't help the kid and doesn't sacrifice his, wouldn't want to sacrifice his pants, and yet we're not willing to sacrifice our own material goods to help others, right? That's the connection you have to see, that Singer is trying to get us to see. You have to see that we're doing the same thing when we consume and consume and consume and buy unnecessary things, because we're faced with the same choice as saving the child. The only difference, says Singer, is that the child is right in front of us, whereas the other people we're helping are at a distance usually, either in our community at a distance or literally halfway across the world. Which actually brings us to Singer's next point, because he knows people are going to argue against him here. He knows people are going to say, yeah, but Singer, if I see a kid walking, while I'm walking through the park, of course I'm going to help. It's right there. It's easy for me to do it. But I don't see the kids who are drowning and suffering, or, drowning metaphorically, suffering in other countries. I don't see the kids dying of starvation. So why should I help them? I can see the kid. I can see what he needs and what I need to do. I can help him right there. So why am I worrying about kids in other countries who are so far away? Well, Singer's response here is that, look, distance doesn't matter to the value of a life. It doesn't matter how far away someone is. The value of a child's life drowning in front of you is of the same value of a child's life drowning halfway across the world. Right? Your mother's life is just as valuable if she's in the room of your room or if she's halfway across the world. In other words, distance doesn't matter to value of a life. The value of life has value everywhere, right? Unless you're going to say something nationalist like, oh, Americans are better than other people who are born in other countries, but Singer says that's ridiculous. It's what makes life valuable is about the ability to feel pain or pleasure, and that can happen anywhere, right? People can suffer pain anywhere. So Singer would say distance has no bearing on the value of a life. Now he admits, he says, look, I understand that it's easier to help somebody who's close, but that still doesn't mean that they didn't deserve it, that they deserved it more, right? So it's crucial to see that difference. Yes, it's easier to help the child drowning in a shallow pond. Yes, it's easier to give a guy $1 on the street as you're walking by in your own hometown, but that doesn't mean that the people who are not in your hometown and the kids who are not drowning in front of you don't still deserve the help, right? So if all life has value, which utilitarianism says is true, then we are just as obligated to help those who are far away as those who are close to us, even if it's easier for us in practice to help those who are closer to us. So in other words, distance is just completely irrelevant to Singer. It does not matter to whether we should help. Right? So you can't make the argument that, oh, well, Singer, the kid is closer. It's easier to help him. Yeah, it's easier. It doesn't mean the other kids aren't deserving of help too. So, and the second point that Singer makes, and this is ironic considering he was writing this in the 1970s, because sometimes people say, well, I don't even know what I need to do to help these other kids in other countries. I don't even know, how would I even go about helping? And also they might say, plus I'm not sure if the money from charities is actually going to the charities or how much overhead they're taking, and so forth. So Singer's first point here, and again, this is the 70s, he says, look, we live in a global village now. We have a much more heightened communication between our countries. So it's actually easier to figure out what needs to be done than it used to be. Again, this is the last time I'll say it, but the 70s. Now we have the internet, right? We have the internet that literally directly connects us with everybody around the world. So this is one of those cases where many would argue Singer's argument is much stronger now because the global village he's talking about is intense. It's insane how much we're connected. So not only do we live in a global village where we know what needs to be done, there are actually organizations out there. And there's one, I believe, actually I don't mention the reading, but it's called GiveWell.org, GiveWell.org. And it's an organization that evaluates charities based on the scientific method. So in other words, they will go into charities and ask them for their economic information. They'll ask them for their data and their charts on how much they're spending and where the money's going. And they'll give an evaluation of the charity to see if the charity is actually doing what they say they're going to do. And guess what? Lots of charities they've dismissed. If you look on their website, they've said this charity is not legitimate. They're taking too much money, too much overhead. So while it's true that that's an argument against some charities, that there are some charities that are unethical, and some charities that are just incompetent, that's not an argument that's against charity overall, because there are organizations that will guide you to the right charity. For example, one central charity that I donate to that is mentioned and has been evaluated by GiveWell is the Against Malaria Foundation. Right, this is a good organization with people who really want to help. They make an effort to work with local communities. So that's another problem with some charities, especially early charities. They would go into a country, and sometimes they would have to pay off the leader of the country just to get in, and then that would inadvertently give that leader more power, right? So they'd give more money to him, and then he'd be even more oppressive to his people. So there's no doubt that it's true that some charities are actually counterproductive. There's also cases of charities that disrupted the local economy, where the charity was trying to help by giving people like raincoats, and then the raincoat vendor lost his job. He didn't have a job anymore because everyone had free raincoats. Right? So going back to what I mentioned at the start, Singer's arguing that we have to use our minds and our heart together. And to do that, you have to donate to the right charity. So anyways, this is all part of Singer's point that you can't say that there isn't a way to help other people, because even more so today, we definitely live in a global village, and there are definitely resources to find the right way to get your money to the right charity. The second point Singer makes here is he says, somebody might say, well, why should I have to help? Why should I have to donate if there are so many other people in my position who are not donating? I hope it's obvious why this is not a legitimate objection, right? Why should I have to help if no one else is helping? Let's imagine everyone's standing around, there's like 10 people standing around the shallow pond with the kid. And they're all just texting, not paying attention while the kid drowns. Does the fact that other people aren't helping the kid reduce your responsibility to help the kid? No, says Singer. You do the right thing. Right? You go in and you save the child. It doesn't matter if there's 10 people, 20 people, or if it's only you. The right thing is the right thing. In other words, don't use groupthink, right? Don't use the appeal to popularity fallacy, that just because a lot of people believe something or are doing something, it's the right thing to do. If other people aren't helping, it means they should be helping too, right? It doesn't release your responsibility from helping, says Singer. He admits, he says, look, it probably makes you feel better psychologically, because you're like, yeah, screw it, I don't have to help, they're not helping. It makes you feel better. It makes, you have a better sense of conscience, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. You're still not doing the right thing, says Singer. Now, Singer goes on from there to go even further with another objection. So somebody might say, all right, Singer, you've convinced me. I need to donate something to help these people who are suffering, who are worse off than me. You've convinced me, Singer, this person might say. But I'm only going to donate $5, because if everybody else who could donated $5, then the problem would be solved, right? So I'm only going to donate 5, and then my hands will be clean, right? Then I'll have done my part, and if other people want to solve the problem, they can do their part. Singer's response here is more or less that he says a few things, but one central thing he says is that, look, your obligations to help depend on the circumstances. They don't depend on how many other people have helped, right? It's not, the whole point of helping isn't to make you feel better about yourself, right? It's to actually solve the problem. So if you only donate a little bit, it ain't gonna really help solve the problem. You have to donate as much as you can to solve the problem. So it's not just $5. And now, to be fair, Singer would say, if the circumstances were different, you would be obligated to donate less. If we lived in a better world that had less suffering, then the obligations would be less for everybody. But as it is, we live in a world with a great deal of suffering, and so the obligations are greater. The obligations would be zero if we lived in a world, like a perfect future utopia where there wasn't anybody living in poverty or anybody starving. Then nobody would be obligated, right? But Singer's point is that the circumstances change, that means the obligations change. It doesn't matter, you can't just give $5 and wipe your hands of it, because there's still a problem. Singer's, again, after solving the problem, not making somebody feel good for having donated or not. So he mentions that. And then perhaps where he got the most pushback for this article was this next point. And this is his point about duty and charity. So we normally see charity as something that's extra. If you're a person who's wealthy and I find out that you donate to charity, I might think something positive of you and say, oh, that's really nice. What a nice guy. Somebody like Bill Gates, who has worked with Singer, by the way. I might look at someone like Bill Gates and say, really charitable guy. He goes above and beyond. That's nice. On the other hand, our normal way of thinking about moral issues is we don't blame someone who's wealthy and doesn't donate, right? So if I have another friend, and not Bill Gates, who's wealthy, and he does not donate, I don't normally say, what the hell's your problem, man? You got money, why aren't you donating? Like, I don't blame him, right? I don't say that there's something wrong with that. We typically see charity as an additional extra thing, not as an obligation, not as something that we have to do, and we typically don't blame people for not doing it. On the other hand, we typically see duties as things that we do blame people for. For example, if you're a mother or a father, you have a duty to your child. And if you did something idiotic like leave your child out at night, we would rightly blame you and say, hey, you have a duty to keep your child warm and keep him inside. You failed your duty. We would rightly blame you if you were a parent and you engaged in that behavior. So normally, the normal distinction we have is a duty is something that is required, you have to do, you're obligated to do, and we can blame you for not doing it. Whereas charity is the opposite. It's something that's not required, and we cannot blame you for doing it. Singer wants to reverse that trend, or maybe reverse is the wrong word. He wants to bring charity into the realm of duty. He wants to say, no, charity is one type of duty. You have a duty and obligation to your kids, but you also have a duty and an obligation to your fellow humans to reduce their overall suffering, right? Which, again, going back to the greater good. Singer would say, we all have a duty to our fellow humans to produce a better society with less suffering, the greater good for the greatest amount of people. So in other words, Singer is saying we should blame a person who has wealth, who has extra money, who is not donating. We should blame a person who is not donating, who is not following through with the wealth that they have. So we shouldn't just praise Bill Gates, we should blame people who aren't Bill Gates, who aren't donating the extra money that they have. So again, right, a little bit kind of in your face, so to speak, with Singer's argument there. He's saying, no, we should, you do have a duty to be charitable. It's not something extra. And then the final point that I would add to his argument here, just to tie it together, is that the material possession thing, right? When we buy a new shirt because it's the new fashion trend, we're not fulfilling an important need. We have plenty of shirts that can get us by in the day. We don't need to have that shirt that's, $100, $150 or whatever it is just for the fashion. It's not fulfilling an important need, says Singer. Again, buying an extra game when you already have plenty of games to play that you haven't finished, it's not fulfilling an extra need. Buying an extra car when you already have a car that gets you from point A to point B, it's not fulfilling an extra need. So again, going back to the child and the drowning child in the shallow pond, we're just like the child, for Singer, because we're not fulfilling important needs, just like a guy who ignores the child is not fulfilling an important need by keeping his pants not muddy. Right? He should be willing to get his pants dirty to save the child, and we should be willing to sacrifice these extra additional things that we want but that we don't need, so that we can help people who really are in need, who really are suffering, according to Singer. So, and he thinks he's established with his argument that it's required for us to do that. It's not charity, it's a duty for us to help. If we have too much, we have stuff we don't need, it's our duty to give up some of that extra stuff to help other people. So he goes on, before drawing his conclusion in the article, to kind of deal with some counter-arguments to his fourth point about duty and charity that I just outlined, because he knows people are going to challenge him there. And the first challenge comes in this form. It says, basically, the first challenge says, Singer, you can't revamp our understanding of duty and charity because it's too crazy a revision. It's too drastic to somehow say that what we've normally thought of as charity is somehow a duty now. It's just not the way we think of things. For example, we tend to reserve harsh moral judgments for people who murder or steal or cheat. And that seems more legitimate. That's when we say, hey, what the hell is your problem? Why did you steal that money? That makes more sense. But we don't typically say, what the hell is your problem? Why didn't you donate that money? Right? So this objection to Singer's argument, this counter-argument to Singer here, says that the revision of morality to shrink charity into a duty is too far. It goes too far. It's too drastic. And so Singer's response to this is, yeah, but I'm not talking about the way things are. I'm talking about the way things should be. So he says, I understand that it seems like a drastic revision, and I understand that people do think of charity this way, but I think they should not think of it that way. Right? So his response is, yes, you're right. That's the way it is. It's not the way it should be. Just by analogy, consider somebody who was trying to end slavery, and imagine, and this certainly happened, imagine the barriers they ran into when they said, this is wrong, we should stop this practice. And then other people certainly would have said, yeah, but we've had slaves for hundreds of years, it's just the way it is. This is the way people are, you can't change it. And they certainly made arguments, and they did in some debates that we still have records of. You're going to disrupt the economics of the South, and all hell's going to break loose, and it's not going to work. Right? Slavery is the way it's been done. It's the way it has to be. Think of how ridiculous that argument is. Right? And obviously people rightly over time said, this is not the way it should be. Now go back to Singer. Singer's making a similar argument, not against slavery, but against people not donating to charity. And he's saying, yeah, I know that's the way it is. People aren't compassionate. They're not helping, but they should help. Right? So what if we look back in the future in the same way, on our behavior now, in the same way that we look back now on people in slaveholding and human sacrifice, people who engaged in these, what we now consider barbaric practices. So anyway, Singer says, that's the way it should be. The second objection given to Singer's reasoning is that his reasoning actually suggests that we should be working almost constantly to reduce misery, right? We should be constant misery reducers, right? Constant suffering reducers. So all the money we're making at our job is not to advance our career, not to advance our life, not to get a bigger house, not to get a nicer car. It's all just funneled away into charities that is going to help people come out of poverty. It's going to help people stop starving. So some people argue against Singer that it's crazy. We can't just be constant sufferer reducers. Singer's reply here is more or less, yeah, you should. So what? He kind of says, I know this is an implication of my argument. We should be working to reduce suffering. Right? Because for Singer, as a utilitarian, he sees the whole world as his family. Anybody that can suffer is somebody that should be helped. So it's kind of like, if you have somebody in your family with an illness, you drop everything to help them. And Singer is saying, but our family is all human beings. We should be concerned as a species that there are people who are dying before they're 5 years old. We should be concerned as a species that there are people who are getting raped by government officials in countries that have terrible dictators as leaders, right? We should be concerned with these problems, and therefore it does demand a drastic response, Singer would argue, right? So if somebody says, oh, it's so crazy that we have to be working to reduce the misery of that's our whole life now, and Singer says, yeah, because wouldn't it be your whole life if your family was suffering? Well, the universe, the other humans are your family, right? We have a problem. We have too much wealth and little suffering for this small amount of people, and we have this great amount of people on the rest of the planet who are suffering. Let's fix the problem. Or so Singer argues. So he gives a couple conclusions. He says that my logic could lead you to the conclusion that a more moderate version would be that we should prevent bad occurrences if we don't have to sacrifice something of equal moral importance. So just, going back to the drowning child example, he says one conclusion could just be that every time we can prevent something bad from happening, we should do it. But Singer takes it further and says, actually, a better conclusion and more justified one to draw is that we should give as much as possible until giving more would cause us as much suffering as those we're helping, right? And this is the conclusion I want to make clear that Singer argues for, the one he thinks is most justified, the strong one. In other words, that means that if you're, let's say that you only need $28,000 a year to live a perfectly happy, not necessarily happy, but a life of what he calls marginal utility, meaning that you have enough food to eat and not starve, you have enough to drink, you have basic health care, you're healthy, you have a basic shelter, but you have pretty much no luxuries. So everything you make over $28,000, Singer is saying, should just be going to charities to help people. If you make $50,000 and you only need $28,000 to live, $22,000 every year going off to charity. That's marginal utility, is that we're almost in poverty ourselves, we have just enough to not be in poverty, and everything else we're earning is going off to other people. That's the conclusion Singer thinks is justified. Pretty crazy, right? Pretty extreme conclusion. Now, by the way, just in case, because I know some people hear this and they say, who the hell would ever do that? Singer's out of his mind. I mean, he's giving us this moral code for angels. Who would ever do that? There's people who have been doing it, and they're students of Singer's. And Singer actually mentions a couple of them in his TED Talk. I think one guy's name is Toby Ord or something like that. And he basically, he heard the argument from Singer. He made a lot of sense to him. He finds happiness in his life in many other ways. He's an academic now, and he's giving away his money to charity, just like Singer says. He's following the principle of marginal utility. So there are some who have done so. Now, one last point, because I know some of you are also wondering, what about Singer? What about Singer himself? Is he at the level of marginal utility? Well, I'm sorry to say that he's not fully there, but he gives away a lot of his money. He gives away something like 2/5 or 3/5 of his income. And he's a Princeton professor, so he's probably doing pretty well. He gives away a lot of his money to charity every year, and he helps by giving TED Talks and going and speaking and making people aware of the problem. But people have accused him of being somewhat of a hypocrite for not limiting himself all the way to what he argued for. The first thing I'd say is that, remember, this would be another version of the ad hominem, just like it's so easy to do that with people. It's so easy to say, oh, well, you don't do it, so your ideas are wrong. But it's an ad hominem. It's not, an ad hominem means we're dismissing an idea because of the person's characteristics. And just because Singer can't follow his beliefs fully doesn't mean that his argument is unsound, right? Doesn't mean that his argument is not worth considering. So we should assess his ideas separately from his argument. The second thing I'd say is that I think when Singer first wrote this article in the 70s, he was actually thinking practically. So I think he was trying to be a little bit of a dick and trying to make people feel guilty to get them goaded into action, to get them to actually do it. So of course he knew people were going to be like, Singer, are you making me feel guilty because I, have an extra phone? But then he thought they would say, well, but honestly, I do have too many unnecessary things, and maybe it would lead them to donate. So I think his argument was he made his argument a little more harsh in order to reach more people in that way, in order to kind of rile them up and get them to jog them out of their stupor. But at the same time, he does argue that that's the path to follow in order to reach that direction. Now, we're not going to read the articles that there are many out there who have argued against Singer here, but I'll just mention one potential counterargument because, and we'll go back to negative liberty. So what would somebody like Rand or Nozick, somebody who's a libertarian, say in response to Singer here? Because again, remember, Singer's focusing on positive liberty, the right to be given certain things. Well, a libertarian would say, look, we have another conception of rights, another part of morality that's important, and that's deserving something. That's the right to be left alone, and the right to your own earnings, and the right to your own privacy with what you've earned. So a libertarian would say it's very good for people to donate, and they should donate, and they should help, but they should never be obligated or forced into, or made to feel guilty for not donating to reduce the poverty level, right? So, in other words, an argument against Singer is going to take a libertarian turn, and it's going to focus in on the idea of negative rights and kind of earning what you have. The other sort of disquieting implication of Singer is that it does not take into account, his argument does not take into account how people came to acquire their wealth. You have somebody like, say, Eminem, who's a self-made man in some respects because he worked really hard at his music until he was recognized, and then he started earning his own money. So he started out in poverty, wasn't recognized until his late 20s, and then became famous, and he has a lot of money. But you have somebody else who's just gotten donations from their father, inheritance from their father, and they haven't worked for it. Both people are wealthy, and both people could help. But Singer's argument just says, well, both people have to funnel their money out to help. It doesn't deal with the fact that one person earned it and the other person just kind of was given it, right? So if you earned your money, don't you have a little more right to decide what you do with it rather than if it was just given to you? At least one could argue that with a concept of negative rights and the concept of deserving what you've earned. Sometimes those are called entitlement rights, like Nozick's entitlement theory, what you're entitled to. So anyways, that pretty much covers the arguments from Peter Singer and the moral theory of utilitarianism.